Welcome to BrandBusters with your hosts, James Schwinn and Sean Lee. Together, we bust open the latest in CPG, retail media, and life, or whatever the we want. And for today's episode, we got something special cooked up for ya. Extra spicy. Take it away, Sean.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the BrandBusters. We have an awesome guest today. We have Martin Forde with us, who's a retail CPG sales expert with experience spanning from Pepsi to Dr. Squatch. He now runs his own company helping brands with their retail strategies. And Martin's an ultramarathoner and a former D1 athlete, which tends to be a common theme of people that we interview. So we're super pumped to have Martin on the show today. And thanks for joining, Martin. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Sean. Really stoked to be chatting with you both. It's a fun times in CPG land as always. So,
yeah, always good. I guess the first question we have is, we have a lot of people that have been on here that really got their start, I would say, direct to consumer first with, Shopify, Meta, and Google advertising, then moved to Amazon, and then retail was generally the third step from there. In a world that seems to be so heavy in D2C and Amazon, and you see a lot of influencers talking about that space, you've chosen to double down on retail sales as your specialty. I think it's super smart. Obviously, you can get a lot more volume. It's a much different skill set, and it's pretty. It can be pretty hard to do. But why'd you pick that path over kind of bucking the trend of everybody focusing on D2C and advertising and Amazon?
yeah, great question, Sean. I wish I had a cooler story as far as why I just kind of stumbled into this, but I've been doing retail sales really for the entirety of my career. So again, as you mentioned in the intro, I started at big CPG, PepsiCo, Frito-Lay specifically. And what I was doing there was fundamentally just store level execution, running a sales territory and just seeing how product flows through from, in this case, from a DC to a store. And so really cool to, run a sales team at a young age and just get experience of everything from merchandising, promotions, positioning, all the fundamentals that big CPG tends to teach you. I got to pick up, but I really was energized, really liked CPG, really found, again, not too many people like really specializing in it, if you will. But as I'm sure a lot of people can attest to, it sounds like yourself included, just found the career trajectory to be a little slower paced than what I had hoped for. So, that led me into my foray into early stage CPG, which is very much my, I've doubled down on that niche now for years and years. But that's what actually brought me here to LA was, came for a early stage brand at the time called Halo Top and relocated to LA. Spent a few months there, went to an even earlier stage company because I'm a glutton for punishment, I suppose. And all of my scope was entirely focused on helping build new retail distribution. And so to your point, it's not always the easiest path. It's definitely a path less trodden. And I just got a lot of enjoyment about almost this dual-edged approach of both collaborative consultative sales cycles, long enterprise-driven sales cycles, as well as just the strategic element that kind of couples with that. And so you're building a strategy, executing off a strategy that, might take 12 to 18 months to actually see fruit. And so I think I've always enjoyed the long-term nature of retail, that kind of collaborative, consultative, long-term approach. And that led me to what I'm doing today, which again is advising the next generation of disruptive consumer brands into optimizing their retail strategy, taking some of the lessons from, again, companies like Dr. Squatch, which I can speak to at length, but, really just grateful for the opportunity to, be at a point in the industry to just be able to jam with you guys. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. You had a really interesting post yesterday on LinkedIn. If you don't follow or not connected with Martin, make sure to do that. But on the defensibility of retail distribution versus the barrier to entry with like D2C, talk about expanding into retail, because I think everyone thinks they want to get into brick and mortar, but they don't realize retailer selection, like geo selection, working with the buyer, like what's the assortment, like what's the planogram? Because it doesn't matter. You might be in 10,000 doors, but if the execution is proper, it's not on brand, that's actually going to be worse and erode any velocity that you had prior. So like talk to us about how to approach that. And there's a lot of angles there. So go on any and all tangents.
Oh, you went on you gave me a lot to chew on there, James. So I'll try to answer that as succinctly as possible. But this is what I always advise folks with as they enter retail, before they enter retail, particularly, let's say, a direct-to-consumer brand who has an established at-scale channel that's maybe considering retail for the first time. You need to have a strategy. You need to understand why you're even fundamentally approaching retail from the get-go. Is it more to capture more revenue? Are you just trying to grow top line? Are you trying to acquire a net new consumer that you're not getting on D2C? Are you tapped out on growth? You're getting investor pressure to just simply grow more. So these are all reasons I've seen why brands are approaching retail. And so if you don't have a strategy, if you simply just react, which a lot of brands do, it's like, oh my gosh, the Target buyer came calling. It looks like I'm launching nationwide in Target. You see so many examples of brands letting the tail wag the dog, so to speak, and launching in such a way that doesn't align with their long-term interests. And so that's fundamentally what I've done a lot of work with brands, is helping them get to retail readiness. And retail readiness is like such a wide spectrum. I can't even answer like everything that goes into that, but it's everything that you listed out, James. It's everything from like, what's your retailer selection? What's your channel strategy? What's your price point going to be? What is your marketing going to look like? How's your supply chain set up? All of these things that brands don't think about doing, especially if they are digitally native, they've only done e-com. There's so many elements that retail forces you to consider, and it's just a lot. It's a different world entirely. And so it's been a lot of what I feel like I do is just kind of what we're doing right here is education. Is here's how retail operates, here's the cycles that they operate on, here's what is different from selling to a retailer versus selling on direct to consumer. Here's what's similar maybe. And so it's an entirely different process that brands need to be able to wrap their heads around. And again, that's what I love to do, is just be in that position and add value to brands on that journey. And it's been really fun. Just getting to share what I've learned with a wide base of brands and categories.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I think a lot of people on D2C don't think about everything that goes into it, right? Like they may not have the right case counts, the right inner counts that are required to be in retail. Their packaging may not be retail ready, or it may look great when it shows up in the mail, but not stand out on the shelf. I think the whole the fundamentals you probably learned at Pepsi and I learned at P&G, like the product, price, placement, promotion plan, like you really need to think through that. And then resources are limited too, right? You probably can't go into every retailer like a P&G or PepsiCo can. Like with your launch, you might want to pick one strategic retailer, make sure you really get it right. And then maybe year 2, you go to another strategic retailer. I see a lot of, especially early stage brands and founders, just get excited when CVS reaches out or Target reaches out, and they just try to do everything and end up, a year, 18 months later, not being in any of those retailers and have lost a lot of money or kind of taken a bath on it. I think it's really great. What's like the one metric that's your North Star when you're measuring retail success? I've always used units per store per week, or units per store per SKU per week, or dollars per store per week. What do you coach people on, or what should people be thinking about? Which is a lot different than, selling a unit online. You just getting into the retailer, people celebrate that, but then you got to get it to actually move off the shelf and have some velocity. What do you measure and what do you coach people on?
I am not going to have a unique answer to what you just listed, John. Is like you, I think the golden North Star metric in the context of retail is units or dollars per store per week, your velocity in essence. And the reason for such is that's, again, just aligning your KPIs with the retailer's KPIs. The number one thing that, well, not one of the top things that a buyer is going to evaluate a brand on is how are you performing in relative to my hurdle rate and my category average. And so if you are not hitting that hurdle rate, you're not going to be in distribution. That's just a fact. And so like, let's use some simple numbers here. If you have a 2 units per store per week for your particular category and you're selling it 1 unit per store per week, you're done. You're toast. You're cooked. So you need to understand how, to your point, Sean, how to drive productive unit velocities at shelf. And a lot of that work, I actually think, comes on the front end through having an at scale digital presence and digital channel. And so again, I've talked and had some clickbaity posts about the death of D2C. Direct to consumer is not dead, but I think the old model of direct to consumer is dead. You can't launch a brand and be exclusively D2C for 10 plus years like a Dr. Squatch maybe was. I think the timelines from when you get to scale on digital and then transition to retail have shortened. And again, to your point, I think the metrics and the language barriers that shift around when you make that transition is, rather than focusing on AOV and CPAs and these very, again, digital specific metrics, you're now speaking a retail language of units per store per week, which has zero correlation essentially to what you were doing on e-com. And so it's again, the things that influence that are stuff like awareness, stuff like positioning on shelf, your feature support, any trade marketing that you put together. So it's like all of these different levers that you can pull. Need to understand intimately all of them and which ones make sense for the brand to pull and at what time. And so again, this is what I love to help brands do, and it's been my pleasure to get to see and learn just some best practices as far as what works, what doesn't, wins, losses, all of the above. So.
You brought up a great point. I've seen some of those clickbaity headlines, but I think what people don't realize is D2C can actually be such a springboard for retail expansion. Like, think about how much data it almost informs your retail launch strategy, right? It can look at which geos across the country are you picking up velocity in, which you can then leverage to those specific or regional retailers. Think about the assortment strategy around that, and then even think about your CRM and email list. You have a whole customer base that you can kind of get this campaign out to drive that early velocity. So these things don't have to cannibalize one another. They can work harmoniously, and you can drive new acquisition and growth in these other channels.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, James. I think D2C is going to remain a really critical channel for brands in the future. I think it's just very, very hard to cold start a brand on D2C today. And that's what I talk about a lot is again, if I'm a new brand, I would almost be parallel pathing retail, D2C, Amazon, every single channel that you can possibly be distributed on, because you don't know which one is going to be most resonant until you actually get placement in it. But to your point, James, I think it's interesting to see this old playbook of you start D2C, you build initial scale, you use the data from D2C to be able to drive your retail strategy, and then use that retail strategy to fuel growth, etc. I think that playbook still is in a lot of ways quite resonant, but it doesn't. It's just been compressed, I think, for a lot of brands which are maybe earlier in their life cycles today. And so again, I was every single brand I've worked with in the early stage capacity has had a direct to consumer channel. And so I'm nothing but a believer in the value of that channel and the first party data that you can collect from it. But times have changed. I think ever since the iOS 17 or did I get the update right?
Whichever one it was. Yeah, when iOS messed up Meta basically.
Yeah. Once you couldn't attribute where your sales were coming from and couldn't target people to the same degree of granularity, D2C economics and CPA specifically just skyrocketed. You're just not able to understand who you're targeting on these paid media channels. And I think it's led to quite a bit of a reckoning for a lot of digital brands, is brands that maybe didn't have any meaningful point of differentiation or any real lifetime value, like strategy of how do we not only acquire a customer profitably, but how do we nurture them and get them to purchase more across our product portfolio. I think there's absolutely a tiering of digitally native brands that I think you see today that have just absolutely crushed it and are now taking that scale, taking that success on direct to consumer, and are successfully, again, applying those concepts to retail.
Yeah, I think one interesting point there too is like a lot of direct to consumer marketers or Amazon marketers are so used to like, I spend this and I get this kind of return or ROAS, or I do this activity and I see the immediate result from it. I think what people fail to realize too is like all these channels like interact together, right? You're just giving the consumer more places to shop, to buy your product where they're already shopping. So I always see like if you're on D2C and you're on Amazon, someone might see your D2C ad, but then buy on Amazon. If you have Walmart distribution, they might see your D2C ad and go and buy it at Walmart. They might see your Amazon ad and then they happen to be at Walmart and buy it there. They might be at the retail shelf and then not want to buy it right then. They might do some more research and buy it on Amazon. So I think it's hard for marketers that want to be able to trace back, I did this activity and it resulted in this purchase. Once you start getting multiple channels and you become omnichannel, it's a lot harder to make those attributions, but you know that they all work together. And I think that's one thing that D2C marketers struggle with when they initially go to retail or initially expand to Amazon.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Sean. I think it's this, again, this you're spoiled on the digital channels. I think it's you're used to this, to your point, this instant correlation that you can really draw of, oh, when I do X, Y occurs, and I can scale that really linearly and predictably. The same does not exist within retail. And so when you're investing, a lot of those investments and those decisions happen on the front end, and you're not going to necessarily know the impact of those decisions from 3, 6, 9 months in the future, which I think is a really, really hard just paradigm shift for a lot of brands to reckon with. And again, that's I think the value of retail fundamentally, is because it's a diverse channel, a disparate channel that's not correlated with your direct to consumer channel. I believe there's a huge halo effect when you have retail distribution. It is in effect a way to acquire a consumer who's already maybe aware of your brand for much cheaper, much lower of a CPA than say on your D2C channels. And so I think this was a reshift we used when I was during my time at Dr. Squatch. Was, okay, we need to stop thinking of retail as just a revenue channel. It is a customer acquisition channel akin to a Meta or a YouTube that just happens to drive revenue. And that, I think, thesis really informed a lot of the merchandising strategy, a lot of the placements, a lot of these elements where I think kind of laid the groundwork for that brand to be as successful as it was, came from that thesis of retail is another way to activate a consumer who has maybe not ever tried the brand, because they never will try the brand because they don't buy things on direct to consumer, for example. So again, I think that synergy, that overlap between digital channels and retail channels is only becoming more and more apparent.
So for brands that are trying to break into retail, they're probably dependent on the vertical per se, but are there certain retailers that you found are more friendly to emerging or challenger brands, and like even getting to the table with this? Are the retailers finding them? Are they having to go through, as a sales guy for the last 12 years, is there a line on them kind of prospecting the retailer and kind of courting them? Like, what does that process entail? And then who's kind of the friendliest with these brands trying to break in?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer directly, James, because again, it's really dependent on the brand, on the category, on the retailer. There's so many different variables, but I'll try to just kind of, let's speak in generalities, and I'll I'll talk about a retailer I'm super bullish on that most people are steer away from, I think, in the context of early stage initial launches into retail. But let's make some assumptions. I think a brand that has achieved some sort of meaningful scale on direct to consumer. And so for me, I think an arbitrary like revenue framework or hurdle rate, if you will, is about 5 million, maybe 10 million in top line per year. If you've hit that, you have a meaningful amount of consumer awareness. You obviously have achieved product market fit. You ideally are profitable, and so you have an ability to invest in some of these retailer programs. If you're at that scale, you are in effect retail ready. You've proven out that there is consumer demand for your product. I think where brands need to put a lot of rigorous thought process in is like, what are the retailers where my consumers shop? And so that depends on the brand entirely. And so it's like, that's where it's, again, hard to answer your question, James, of like, what's the best retailer to start with? It's dependent on the brand is my answer to that. So back to your point, Sean, is like, as far as first party data that can be really valuable to validate what retailers to launch in, D2C, accessing your consumers, having literally the emails of your consumers, you can ask them. And so you can do some meaningful consumer insights research, validating, hey, like if we have this brand, where would you prefer to purchase it in stores? And you can get that consumer and then get that data from the consumer, and you can use that data to then sell it to the exact retailer that you're approaching. And so that's where I think is the power of D2C, is you can really, really hone in on exactly what it is the retailer that would make most sense for your brand. And you can demonstrate that with meaningful data. And you can even, you can get really, really sophisticated with this and say, oh, we over index, our brand over indexes as Costco shoppers 2x versus the general population, let's say. And so you can use that data as part of this narrative as far as when you approach those retailers, how to sell into them, how to engage with them. And that's again, kind of gets your foot in the door, so to speak, as far as like how to again, initially engage with them. But as far as retailers that, again, I remain bullish on, and again, I'm going to go against the green here, is I think if you are the right brand, if you are at an appropriate scale, and if you're very sober about what it means to go into this partnership, Walmart is truly one of the best partners for the right brand. And so that's not all brands. Please don't misconstrue anyone who's listening to this. Not all brands, early stage brands, are ready for retail. But if you have a mass market brand and you are looking to get as wide of a base of distribution to validate the rest of your retail strategy, Walmart's king. And I think it's been really interesting to work with Walmart over the years and to see their focus and investments in these emerging brands, as they call them. It's been very, very clear. And it's like, it goes well beyond even just Dr. Squatch, a very close to the heart example. But like, you look at some more recent examples, even within personal care, Curie is a cool one. I think W is a great one. There's a ton of brands, even just like within that specific subcategory, natural personal care, that are absolutely just booming within the Walmart ecosystem. And that strategy of finding these really disruptive brands, driving a net new consumer to Walmart, there's advantages to Walmart for that. And using that initial new customer to surprise and delight them as they find these brands they wouldn't expect in the Walmart box. There's all these synergistic effects that you have both on the brand side, obviously for Walmart, obviously for kind of the overall health of the consumer ecosystem. So again, if you can check all these boxes, Walmart's a phenomenal partner, and I have nothing but good things in my years of working with them. And but again, they don't always work. And I'm happy to speak
Yeah.
to that. So
Yeah, and James, I think one of the things that I think one of the things that I learned early on. So I launched a brand called Zevo out of P&G's like venture capital group before I left there. I think it's doing about 200 million in annual revenue now. We made it to about 5 million on Shopify, so we weren't quite at that 10 million mark, but we wanted to go to retail. We surveyed our customers. We looked at the profile. We looked at kind of zip codes of where they're shopping. And insect's unique, right? This is like goes to your example. It really depends on the category and the product. So Walmart would be number one, Target's number two by like market share, then Home Depot, then Lowe's. We didn't want to go Walmart, Target because we weren't confident in our supply chain. We weren't ready yet. So we went with Home Depot for exclusive for a year, which they loved because they don't get a ton of innovation. But we use the data from our D2C to be like, hey, here's our shopper, here's their income, here's the zip codes where we like heat map where they've been buying. And as opposed to going into every Home Depot, we picked I think 70% of their stores that overlapped. They're like, they called them like A, B, C, and D stores. We were in like all the A and B's and maybe part of the C's. And we avoided the D's because we're like, you know what? Our shopper just doesn't overlap there. We're probably not going to move units per store per week there. The buyer loved it because we were hitting all the thresholds in the stores that we were in. And then we were able to use that data in our D2C data to go to Target the next year. And then ultimately Walmart year 3. Just again, we probably would have done both more quickly. We just weren't confident in our supply chain to be able to deliver. But I think that's excellent advice to really use your data, ask your customers, and then tailor it to the retailer. But kind of dovetailing off of that, you were around for the Dr. Squatch Walmart launch. I know you posted about that quite a bit. You led a lot of their retail strategy. Obviously it's a great success story. What are some stories or lessons from the early days there? Were there any things that you did that you wouldn't have done early on, or were there things that you did that worked great and you would recommend others do and kind of double down on?
Yeah, great question, Sean. I'm going to speak in generalities here, but some good again for context for the group. Was the first sales hire at Dr. Squatch and helped lead their retail expansion, culminating in a national rollout at Walmart. So through that experience, made a lot, again, I think a really, really great example of an at-scale digital business successfully transitioning to brick and mortar in a very large, impactful way, i.e. via Walmart distribution. Some things I would maybe watch out and do differently, be aware of in the context of launching a brand at that scale into Walmart is the first is relates to your pricing, and specifically your direct to consumer pricing, your D2C pricing, your retail pricing, and your Amazon pricing. And avoiding channel conflict throughout those is something I would advise everybody to do a lot of thought, very, very rigorous thought on how to avoid conflicts between those three channels. That's something a big mistake I think I made and we really underestimated in that launch was what's the degree that, again, there's competitive dynamics that are outside of your purview as a brand, even at Dr. Squatch's scale. But Walmart and Amazon are competitors. And so again, how do you balance this maybe disparate pricing strategy you have across those channels and not penalize any of those channels simultaneously? And so that's a really meaty question to answer, and it takes a lot of we could spend the rest of the time just talking about how that's
hard too, right? Because a lot of D2C brands or a lot of Amazon brands may sell at a higher price point than would actually appeal to the Walmart or Target shopper at the shelf. So you immediately many people have some challenges to try solve of price point and making sure there's not conflict.
Well, and conversely, so the last 5 years I've been either agency or ad tech side, more skewed towards Amazon, and Amazon is notorious for price matching. So if you have a lower price, obviously they've got a lot of fees, right? The FBA fee, referral fee, inbound, there's a lot of costs there. So their bots are going to scrape and they're going to match that. So while you might have had a certain margin point or threshold, that now is going to be irrelevant if you don't have consistent pricing strategy across the board. So Saw that come up a lot. We've been hitting on data quite a bit, and obviously super data rich for D2C. I think Amazon especially has made some leaps and bounds recently with like Amazon Marketing Cloud and being able to target like cart abandoners and other different like lifestyle audiences, what have you. What type of data are brands able to really glean from retail? Is that still a little bit of a gap? And I think what I guess breakthroughs, if any, are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, great question. I think like let's talk again. I'll speak high level, and I'm no data expert, know enough to be dangerous, obviously. But like I think a big trend I've noticed across retail data specifically is you see every single retailer essentially monetizing their own 1P data. And so you
Yes.
see this at like obviously Walmart just launched Luminate, and so you have Kroger, they've got 8451, and then of course you have all the syndicated data platforms, your Nielsen's, your IRIs, where you have to again pay to play, so to speak. And so I think you're going to continue to see that trend across the board of this monetization, and i.e. an increased cost for brands to be able to access that data. You have nowhere near the level of granularity, visibility, and access that you do on, say, in your example, Amazon. James, is just in the context of retail, and that's I think one of the big cons of retail is it's just an expensive channel. You have to invest a lot in it to get any of the data you need to be able to make the decisions that move the needle for the brand. And so again, that's a little soapbox I'll maybe step down from, but it's interesting to see this this trend unfold within retailers. Is they're realizing how much brands are willing to pay for this data. And I think more than anything underscores the significance that retail data can actually influence and how much richness and insight it can add, more so even beyond like, basic supply chain planning and demand forecasting and things like that. But just how does what are the category dynamics of your particular category? What how are we performing in this category in this channel relative to another channel? There's so many different ways you can layer this and slice this, and so I think again that's why you see such a I think demand for that retailer data specifically. But yeah, it's interesting to see, interesting to watch unfold. But yeah, that's just a high level trend I've seen. And I definitely don't see it going away anytime soon. So
yeah, that makes sense. From an execution standpoint, once you're in retail, obviously there's a lot of stores, a lot of different store managers. Let's say you're running an end cap promotion, or you've sent a floor stand in. What advice do you have for people that pay for those programs to make sure they actually get executed, right? Because oftentimes you could send a floor stand in, it sits in the back room, the manager or the clerk never actually puts it out on the floor, and then you're wondering why you had some underperformance across a variety of stores for this initiative you paid for, or promotion that you paid for.
Yep.
How do you think about that? I'm sure you dealt with that a lot at your Frito-Lay days as well.
Oh boy, yeah. It's some shared trauma, maybe. Sean is execution in the box for these features. So let's again, I'll cite some data here. I believe, and it depends on the retailer, but like take Walmart for example. I think 60 to 70% execution of a feature is really good. Kroger, maybe it's 70 to 80% execution of a feature or an end cap. Really, really solid. And so you're always going to have this delta of anywhere from 20 to 40% of stores that are not just straight do not set your feature. And then again, when you to use your example, Sean, of understanding why that occurs at store level, stores are inundated with displays and just stuff that goes on in a store. And if they just get this huge freaking pallet display of like just product and they have a space for it just somewhere else, they're going to break that thing down. They're just going to cram it on some crappy location and just deal with it in that way, rather than execute this beautiful, corrugate display that you spent a ton of money and capital and logistical efforts in executing. So it's absolutely a really hard thing for brands, an expensive thing for brands to have to manage. One thing that again, it's so painful to recommend this, and for anyone who's actually going through this, please reach out, because I'm working on trying to find a solution for this. But actually paying some of the third-party companies to go out and execute, or at least audit your execution, is literally the only way you can close that gap a little bit. And to do so, you're talking about an extra anywhere from, depends on the stores, they're usually 15, $20 a visit. And so if you're doing 4,000 stores, you just spent another, 50 to 100K on execution alone. And so I think there's some really interesting new companies that are coming out that are specifically trying to solve for that execution gap. And again, I'm going to make that plug, is anyone who's listening to this who has an execution challenge. I'm working on some side projects of just trying to find and validate ways, and find ways that to be able to execute cheaper than the Acostas and other like major giant preferred service providers, as Walmart calls them. Because again, they're just like, again, I'm not gonna badmouth anybody here, but they're just big and slow and expensive, and that's hard. That's hard for an early stage brand to be able to swallow that. And unfortunately, that's kind of the reality, is like that's how you close that execution gap. So it's it's just a cost benefit analysis I think brands have to run. It's like, what's the incremental 5-10% of execution going to be? What does that lift in sales, that extra execution, get me? In terms of, is that worth the investment in hiring one of these third-party companies to go out and audit execution? So again, it's not easy. It's a tough pill to swallow, but executing features is a very, very painful, very painful approach. But it's just kind of par for the course, I think, in retail land. So,
and I can't remember the name of the specific company we used, but when I was launching Zevo in the early days, we did a lot of floor stands and things like that. There was a company that crowdsourced it, where it wasn't that expensive, but people would almost like an Uber Eats would get prompted to go and take a picture of the floor stand and then post it back, so we could at least collect the data and see where the outages were. We were fortunate that the buyer and category manager were very big on like making sure the launch was successful. So we would do that, work with them and be like, here are the list of stores where they couldn't find it. Can you go, do what you can, like send an email to the general manager of those stores and try get it out. We had some moderate success with that, but again, it is the Wild West, and every store is different, and every way that you execute is going to be different.
Completely agree.
So I know you work with a lot of emerging brands. I would say, at what juncture, because the retailers are so different, right? And you see the real incumbents and established brands, like they have retailer specific like headcount. So like, at what point do you go from one, working with a consultant, to hiring someone to own retail distribution, to then specializing by retailer? I know there's probably some broad brushstrokes here, but some general rules of thumb based on your experience.
Yeah, it's, again, depends on the brand. Again, that's going to be my answer to a lot of this. Is a lot of variables, depends on the scale, depends on, if you want to in-house things from the get-go and kind of gain those learnings, or do you want to kind of shortcut some of the process and just go faster, essentially. I think it's a speed cost equation that brands have to analyze. But I think for a lot, I'll speak in generalities once more. I think for a lot of early stage brands, I think a lot of them can get all the way through retail execution on their first few partnerships, maybe like a Walmart or a Target or a Whole Foods or a Kroger launch even. They can do that launch using nobody but consultants and like myself, and external resources, and some dedicated owner internally who's just kind of shepherding things along. And I think like that's kind of the new wave of I think this approach of just hiring an in-house salesperson who then goes down and knocks down as much distribution as they can and tries to open as many doors as they can. I think that approach is a bit dated. Honestly, it's not very strategic, and usually it's hard to find, to as what kind of catalyzed this conversation, Sean, of it's hard to find people who specialize in retail specifically. It's just a fact, and so.
And even then, that's
I think
specialized in all the retailers, right? Like, because people are usually
Yeah.
really good at Walmart or really good at Target or a couple of them, but not 20 of them.
Exactly. And so it's hard to find those generalists. And so that's where I guess I've just been able to carve out a niche for myself. Is I've worked with every single retailer, every single class of trade, everything from the home improvements of the world to deep discount chains to Walmart to mass to drug to club to grocery. And so that breadth has really been rewarding for me and really impactful. It's awesome being a generalist and having called on so many different retailers, but I don't think a brand needs to in-house that function until they actually have validated that retail itself is a viable channel. And then again, to your question, James, is like, when do they go channel specific? That comes even later. That comes when you're literally in every single class of trade and your retail business is 9 figures or above, and you need to start, more hiring account managers to run the day-to-day operations of that business, maybe moving some business away from brokers and things like that. And that comes at a pretty meaningful amount of scale. And you only see that with, again, brands that are scale, are doing, again, 9 figures or more in retail sales alone before there's that degree of specialization. So again, to anyone listening, happy to be a resource, happy to add value in the retail journey and expansion. Because again, I think that's kind of the new wave is having an expert who's seen a lot of brands, seen a lot of categories that can allow you to shortcut some of the mistakes you might make and things you might not necessarily know as you enter retail. That's one of the, I think, advantages of working with, somebody like myself or some of the a million other service providers who are out there who specialize in retail. So yeah, nothing but good things to say about my peers. So
No, that's great. And I think one thing we always, I think it's been a great conversation, but one thing we always like to ask at the end is, outside of work, a lot of people have different hobbies, things that help keep them grounded, things that help keep them focused. It seems like you run a lot. You're an ultra marathoner, former athlete. How does training and kind of doing some of these extreme events help you with what you're trying to do, helping clients and stay grounded at work?
Yeah, no, great question, Sean. Like, to anyone listening, I am a ultra endurance athlete. I love just, going out and doing, putting 20 miles in a random weekend on trails. And so I describe myself as just a mountain athlete. And so I'll do everything from, hiking, ultralight backpacking to trail running to hiking to ski touring to rock climbing. So really just anything outside in the mountains is really what really, just to your point, Sean, grounds me. It kind of shakes me out of that, the day to day, if you will. I think like nature has an immense way of being able to reset folks and kind of put things into perspective, give you a sense of scale of what matters, what doesn't, maybe. And so I think that's been really helpful for me. Is I've kind of embraced this entrepreneurial journey of focusing on bigger picture, focusing on consistent daily actions, which move the ball forward. And so, there's so many lessons which endurance sport teaches you. And I'm just really grateful to live in such a place that has, like LA, that has such a access to just incredible nature. Unfortunately, some of it's on fire right now, and so hopeful by the time this goes live, those are extinguished. But it's to anyone kind of deep in the trenches, maybe a little lost as far as, how to get some better balance. I could not preach more the grounding and resetting nature that the outdoors can have on people. And so that can just be anything from a woods walk to 100-mile ultra marathon. So it's to each their own, and just get outside and disconnect and be contemplative and present and aware. And that it pays dividends, I think, in terms of mental, physical, spiritual health across the board. So all for it. Anyone wants to come do some trail runs in LA, hit me up. So
yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, Martin, thanks for joining. I think we really enjoyed the conversation. I think people will get a lot out of it. So anybody, what's the best way to reach you or connect with you? If you want to.
Yeah, best way to reach me is you gave an earlier shout, but follow me on LinkedIn, Martin Forde, Forde. There's an E at the end. I talk a lot about, D2C to retail strategy, just trends within consumer news, things like that. Send me a message, book some time on my calendar. Happy to talk with anyone, anytime, about in any scope and capacity. I just truly love giving back to brands at early stages and just adding value on this pivotal journey to retail. So it's my privilege, my pleasure. And so, get in touch on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And if you found this conversation helpful, please share it with a friend, family member, colleague, anybody else that you think will get value out of it. And follow us on LinkedIn and X, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search BrandBusters e-commerce podcast, and you should be able to find it. So thanks again, Martin, and we appreciate your time today.
Yeah, appreciate it, Sean. Thanks, James. Talk soon, guys.